Captain Jake Morrison sat hunched over the communications desk, his back aching from 6 straight hours in the same position. The coffee mug in his hands had turned stone cold, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the blinking red light that meant Colony 7 was still out there. Still calling for help. Still dying. The message played again. Same desperate voice. Same horrible words. This is Director Lisa Park, New Haven Colony 7. We are under attack by hegemony forces. Civilian casualties are mounting. They're targeting the schools first, then the hospitals. They want us to watch our children die before. Static swallowed the rest. Jake's hands tightened around the coffee mug until the ceramic started to crack. A tiny sound, but on the quiet bridge of the TSF Resolute, everyone heard it. Everyone felt what it meant. This was the 144th time Jake had listened to Lisa Park's final transmission. Each replay carved something deeper into his soul. Something dark and angry that 3,000 years of peace treaties couldn't contain. Behind him, his bridge crew moved like ghosts. Quiet footsteps. Whispered reports. The kind of careful silence people use around something dangerous that might explode. Communications Officer Emma Rodriguez cleared her throat softly. When she spoke, her voice shook just a little. Sir, we're getting more calls. Colonies 3, 9, and 12 are all broadcasting the same type of message. Jake slowly turned his chair around. His crew looked back at him with hollow eyes. These weren't the bright young officers who had left Earth 3 months ago, full of hope and dreams of exploring the galaxy. The hegemony's so-called pacification campaigns had stolen that innocence. Night after night, they'd listened to their own people scream across the void. Night after night, they'd done nothing because their orders said they couldn't interfere. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson was 25 years old, but he looked 50. Dark circles under his eyes. Hands that shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. He pulled up the star map with practiced efficiency, red dots marking the colonies under attack. Captain, Fleet Command is 8 days away at maximum speed. By the time they arrive. Marcus didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone on the bridge had seen the aftermath photos from colonies 1 and 5. Entire cities turned into sheets of black glass. Hospitals melted into twisted metal sculptures. Playgrounds where children used to laugh now marked with memorial stones. The ceasefire accords, Jake said, tasting bitterness with each word. 3,000 years of honorable peace. He laughed, but it was the sound a man makes right before he breaks something. Remind me again why we can't help our own people. Commander Beth Williams looked up from her tactical station. At 38, she was the oldest person on the bridge, the closest thing they had to someone who remembered what real war looked like. Right now, her jaw was clenched so tight Jake worried she might crack her teeth. Official fleet policy says isolated colony attacks don't count as breaking the peace treaty. The hegemony calls it civil disobedience suppression. Civil disobedience. Jake spoke each word separately, letting them hang in the air like poison gas. Children playing hopscotch. Doctors saving lives. Teachers reading stories. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Civil disobedience. The communications console crackled to life one more time. Lisa Park's voice came through the static, weaker now but still fighting. If anyone can hear this transmission, tell our families back home that we died as humans. Tell them we never begged for mercy. Tell them we... Silence. Not static this time. Just empty, endless silence that meant Colony 7 had finally stopped broadcasting forever. Jake stared at the dead console for a long moment. His breathing grew deeper, more controlled. His crew watched nervously as something changed in their captain's posture. His shoulders straightened. His jaw set into a hard line. When he looked up, there was something new in his eyes. Something that made the bridge feel suddenly colder. Emma, he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut steel, open a direct channel to Earth Command. High priority. Sir, our standing orders clearly state that we're not supposed to contact Command unless. Open the channel. The words came out flat and final. Emma's fingers flew over her controls without another word of protest. Jake Morrison had spent 15 years following orders without question. 15 years being the perfect fleet officer who colored inside the lines and never made waves. But as he waited for the connection to Earth to go through, he realized something important had just died inside him. The part that believed following rules was more important than protecting innocent people. The part that could listen to children die and call it acceptable losses. That man was gone now, burned away by 144 repetitions of Lisa Park's final, desperate plea for help. What remained was something older. Something that remembered why humans had crawled to the top of Earth's food chain in the first place. Admiral Rebecca Hayes appeared on the main screen, her weathered face showing the strain of 3 months spent explaining to grieving families why their loved ones had to die for the greater good of galactic peace. Behind her, Jake could see the familiar crisis center at Fleet Command Headquarters. A room that had become far too busy since the hegemony started their pacification program. Captain Morrison, Hayes began, but Jake cut her off before she could say another word. Admiral, I need to know something. How many more colonies have to burn before we're allowed to defend our own people? The question hung between them like a challenge. Hayes' expression tightened. She'd been dreading this call, knowing it would come eventually. Every captain in the fleet was asking the same question, and she was running out of answers that didn't sound like excuses. Captain, you know the political situation is extremely complicated. Complicated. Jake stood up from his chair, and his crew could see his hands trembling. Not from fear. From rage that had been building for months and finally found a crack to escape through. Admiral, I just spent 6 hours listening to 800 civilians die in real time. The hegemony didn't just kill them quickly. They made sure we could hear every scream, every plea for help, every child calling for their parents. The ceasefire accords specifically prohibit. I don't care about the accords. The words exploded out of Jake with enough force to make everyone on the bridge take a step backward. In 15 years of service, none of them had ever heard their captain raise his voice above a polite request. They're picking off our colonies one by one like targets at a shooting gallery, and we're sitting here with our hands tied because someone 3,000 years ago signed a piece of paper. Admiral Hayes went very still on the screen. When she spoke again, her voice carried a warning that could freeze helium. Captain Morrison, you are dangerously close to insubordination. Good, Jake shot back without hesitation. Because I'm about to jump over that line with both feet. Admiral, I'm formally requesting permission to engage hegemony forces at Colony 7's coordinates. Permission absolutely denied. Jake leaned forward until his face filled the camera pickup. Then I'm informing you that in exactly 30 minutes, the TSF Resolute is going to experience a catastrophic navigation system malfunction that will accidentally drop us right in the middle of whatever hegemony fleet is currently turning human children into ash. The silence stretched between Earth and the Outer Rim colonies like a rope pulled tight enough to snap. Admiral Hayes stared at Jake with something approaching horror. This was mutiny, plain and simple. The kind of career-ending decision that would see him court-martialed and imprisoned. Captain Morrison, if you engage hegemony forces without proper authorization, you'll face court-martial proceedings. Your entire crew will be charged with violations of the ceasefire accords. Your military career will be over before. My career? Jake's laugh could have etched glass. Admiral, in the past 3 months, I've listened to 17,000 human beings die while following orders to do absolutely nothing. If keeping my career means listening to 17,000 more people die, then court-martial me. Execute me if you want. At least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror afterward. Commander Williams stepped forward, moving into camera range with the deliberate precision of someone making a life-changing decision. Admiral Hayes, I'd like to formally log a statement for the record. The crew of the TSF Resolute unanimously supports Captain Morrison's navigation malfunction. One by one, every officer on the bridge moved into view of the camera. Lieutenant Thompson, still looking like a college kid but standing like a soldier ready for war. Communications Officer Rodriguez, tears streaming down her face but her jaw set with absolute determination. Chief Engineer Danny Park stepped forward last, and Jake realized with a chill that he was Lisa Park's younger brother. The man who had just listened to his sister die while he stood helpless in a Starship engine room. You're all throwing away your careers, Admiral Hayes said quietly. Everything you've worked for. Your futures, your family's security, everything. Jake looked at his crew, then back at the Admiral on the screen. When he spoke, his voice was calm and certain. Gnome, we're finally starting our real careers. The ones where we protect people instead of watching them die. He reached over and cut the transmission, leaving Admiral Hayes staring at a blank screen 60 light-years away. For a moment, the bridge of the Resolute was completely silent except for the hum of the ship's engines and the soft beeping of instruments. Then Marcus Thompson looked up from his navigation console and asked the question they were all thinking. Captain, what are your orders? Jake Morrison looked out at the stars through the main viewer. Somewhere out there, Colony 7 was burning. Somewhere out there, the hegemony fleet responsible was probably moving on to their next target, confident that humans would continue to follow 3,000-year-old rules while their own people died. Set course for Colony 7, Jake said quietly. Maximum speed. And Marcus. Yes, sir. Make sure our weapons systems are fully operational. It's time the galaxy remembered something important about humans. What's that, Captain? Jake's smile would have made a shark nervous. We're the species that spent 10,000 years learning how to kill everything else on our planet before we ever reached for the stars. And we've had 3,000 years to get creative. The holographic display flickered to life, casting blue light across the bridge of the TSF Resolute. Admiral Rebecca Hayes appeared like a ghost made of light and worry lines. Her face looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, which was probably true. For 3 months, she'd been the one who had to knock on doors and tell families why their sons and daughters were dead. Why the greatest military force in human history couldn't save a single colony. Behind the Admiral, Jake could see the crisis center at Fleet Command. It used to be a quiet place where old officers played chess and filed reports. Now it buzzed with activity day and night. Screens everywhere showed red dots marking dead colonies. Staff officers ran between workstations carrying news that got worse by the hour. Captain Morrison, Admiral Hayes started to say, but Jake wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. Admiral, I need a straight answer. Jake's voice was controlled, but his crew could hear the steel underneath. How many more colonies have to die before we're allowed to fight back? Hayes' face tightened. Her eyes darted away from the camera for just a second. She'd been dreading this conversation. Every captain in the fleet was asking the same question, and she was running out of answers that didn't sound like lies. Captain, you have to understand that the political situation is extremely complicated. Complicated? Jake stood up slowly. His coffee mug sat forgotten on the console, cold and bitter like everything else in his world right now. His hands trembled slightly, and his crew noticed. They'd never seen their captain's hands shake before. But this wasn't fear. This was rage that had been building for months, pressing against his self-control like water against a cracking dam. Admiral, I spent the last 6 hours listening to 800 people die. Jake's voice grew quieter, which somehow made it more frightening. 800 men, women, and children. The hegemony didn't just shoot them quickly and move on. They took their time. They made sure we could hear every scream, every plea for help, every child calling for mommy. The bridge went dead silent. Even the usual hum of the ship's systems seemed muted, as if the Resolute itself was holding its breath. The ceasefire accords specifically state that. I don't want to hear about the accords. The words exploded out of Jake like a bomb going off. The sound echoed through the bridge, making everyone jump. Communications Officer Rodriguez actually took a step backward. In 15 years of service under Captain Morrison, none of them had ever heard him raise his voice above a polite request for coffee. They're hunting our people like animals. Jake continued, his voice rising with each word. Picking off our colonies one by one while we sit here doing nothing because some politicians 3,000 years ago signed a piece of paper. Admiral Hayes went very still on the screen. Her face turned pale, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of warning that could freeze a star. Captain Morrison, you are walking a very dangerous line right now. What you're suggesting sounds dangerously close to mutiny. Good, Jake shot back without even pausing to think. Because I'm about to jump over that line with both feet. He leaned forward until his face filled the camera pickup, his eyes boring into the Admiral's through 60 light-years of empty space. Admiral Hayes, I am formally requesting permission to engage hegemony forces at Colony 7's last known coordinates. Permission is absolutely denied. Jake's smile was the kind that made people check their weapons. Then I'm officially informing you that in exactly 30 minutes, the TSF Resolute is going to experience a catastrophic navigation system malfunction. A completely accidental malfunction that will unfortunately drop us right on top of whatever hegemony fleet is currently turning human children into radioactive dust. The silence that followed could have been measured in geological ages. Admiral Hayes stared at Jake through the holographic display with something that looked like horror mixed with admiration. This wasn't just insubordination. This was mutiny, plain and simple. The kind of career-ending decision that would see him court-martialed and thrown into a military prison for the rest of his life. Captain Morrison, Hayes said slowly, choosing each word carefully, if you engage hegemony forces without proper authorization, you will face a court-martial. Your entire crew will be charged with violations of the ceasefire accords. Your military career will be terminated. Your family's benefits will be revoked. Your pension, your medical coverage, everything you've worked for over 15 years of service will be gone. Jake's laugh could have etched patterns in steel. My career? Admiral, in the past 3 months, I've listened to 17,000 human beings scream for help while I followed orders to sit on my hands and do absolutely nothing. If keeping my precious career means listening to 17,000 more people die while I watch, then court-martial me. Execute me if you want. At least afterward I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror without wanting to throw up. The bridge crew exchanged glances. This was the moment of truth. They could all feel it hanging in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Whatever happened next would change everything. Commander Beth Williams stepped forward with deliberate precision. At 38, she was old enough to remember what real principles looked like. Her boots clicked against the deck plating as she moved into camera range, each step measured and final. "Admiral Hayes," Williams said, her voice steady as granite bedrock, "I would like to formally log a statement for the permanent record. The entire crew of the TSF Resolute unanimously supports Captain Morrison's navigation malfunction." One by one, the rest of the bridge crew stepped into view of the camera. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson moved first, his young face set with determination that made him look older than his 25 years. Communications Officer Emma Rodriguez followed, tears still streaming down her cheeks but her jaw locked with absolute resolve. Chief Engineer Danny Park stepped forward last. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized who the man was. Danny Park. Lisa Park's younger brother. The man who had spent 6 hours listening to his sister die while he stood helpless in an engine room, following orders not to interfere. "You're all committing career suicide," Admiral Hayes said quietly. "Everything you've worked for. Your futures, your family's financial security, your children's college funds. All of it gone." Jake looked at each of his officers, then back at the Admiral on the screen. When he spoke, his voice was calm and absolutely certain. "Noam, we're not throwing away our careers. We're finally starting them. The careers where we actually protect people instead of watching them die for the sake of political convenience." He reached over to the communications panel and hovered his finger over the disconnect button. "Admiral, send my regards to the politicians who think human lives are acceptable losses for galactic stability. Captain Morrison, don't do this. There has to be another way." Jake pressed the button. Admiral Hayes' image flickered and disappeared, leaving the bridge in sudden silence. The only sounds were the soft hum of the ship's life support systems and the barely audible beeping of navigation instruments. For a long moment, nobody moved. They all understood that they had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Their old lives, their old careers, their old certainties about right and wrong, all of that was gone now, cut away as cleanly as severing a communications link. Lieutenant Thompson was the first to speak. "Captain, what are your orders?" Jake Morrison looked out at the stars through the main view screen. Somewhere out there, the hegemony fleet that had murdered Colony 7 was probably already moving toward their next target. Confident that humans would continue to follow ancient rules while their own people burned. "Set course for Colony 7, Jake said quietly. "Maximum speed." "And Marcus?" "Yes, sir." "Make sure all weapons systems are fully operational. It's time to remind the galaxy of something they seem to have forgotten about humans." "What's that, Captain?" Jake's smile would have made a predator nervous. "We didn't crawl to the top of Earth's food chain by following other people's rules. And we've had 3,000 years to get creative about breaking them." The TSF Resolute changed course, its engines building to full power as it headed toward a confrontation that would either end in court-martial or the beginning of a war that would reshape the galaxy. Either way, the waiting was finally over. The TSF Resolute tore through hyperspace like an angry comet, its engines screaming at maximum power. When the ship finally dropped back into normal space at the edge of Colony 7's system, the sudden silence felt like the moment before thunder crashes. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, his knuckles white as he gripped the command chair, and what he saw through the main view screen made his blood turn to ice. New Haven had been paradise once. Jake remembered the recruitment videos from 5 years ago, rolling green hills that stretched to the horizon, covered in grass shipped all the way from Earth at enormous expense. Crystal clear lakes that perfectly reflected the light of 2 small moons. Cities built to look like they'd grown naturally from the landscape, with buildings that curved around ancient trees instead of cutting them down. 300,000 people had called it home. Families who'd saved for decades just for the chance to build something beautiful on a distant world. Now it looked like hell had opened up and swallowed paradise whole. The hegemony hadn't just destroyed New Haven. They'd turned its death into twisted artwork. Entire residential districts had been melted down into perfect geometric patterns, as if some insane artist had decided to use molten metal and human suffering as their medium. The schools and hospitals weren't just bombed, They were carved with burn marks that spelled out the word submission, in 12 different galactic languages. Even from orbit, the message was clear: this is what happens when you resist. The orbital mirrors that had once regulated the planet's climate hung in space like broken flowers, their reflective surfaces twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. They cast strange shadows across the dead world below, creating patterns of light and dark that seemed to move and writhe with malevolent life. "Dear God," Lieutenant Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible above the bridge's quiet hum. "They're still down there." Jake's tactical display lit up with movement signatures on the planet's surface. Hegemony ground forces were moving through the ruins in perfect formation, methodically sweeping every building, every street, every hiding place. They weren't looking for survivors to rescue. They were making sure nothing human remained alive. Even from their position in orbit, the crew could see thin columns of smoke rising from what had once been the children's playground, a place where kids had laughed and played just days ago. Commander Williams' voice cut through the horrified silence like a surgeon's knife. "Sensors are detecting 4 to 7 hegemony vessels in this system. Fleet composition includes 6 Dreadnought-class battleships, 15 heavy cruisers, and 26 support vessels." She paused, running the numbers through her tactical computer one more time, as if hoping she'd made a mistake. "Captain, they have us outgunned by approximately 47 to 1. Jake stared at the tactical display, watching the red dots that represented an alien fleet fresh from committing genocide. Each dot was a ship full of beings who had just spent days methodically murdering every human they could find. Something cold and hard crystallized in his chest, not the white-hot rage from before, but something far more dangerous. Pure, focused purpose. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm that comes right before a storm breaks. "Open a communications channel to the entire hegemony fleet." Communications Officer Rodriguez looked up from her station, confusion clear on her face. "Sir? You want to talk to them?" "All frequencies. Maximum broadcast power. I want every single ship in this system to hear exactly what I have to say." Emma's fingers danced across her control panel, establishing connections across dozens of communication bands. Lights blinked green across her board as the ship's transmitters came online, preparing to broadcast Jake's words across the vast emptiness of space. After a few moments, she looked up and nodded. "Channel open, Captain. You're now broadcasting to all 4 to 7 hegemony vessels and, sir, this is strange. I'm picking up some kind of automated transmission from the planet's surface. Something is still broadcasting down there." Jake stepped in front of the main communication pickup, and his crew saw something in his face they'd never witnessed before. The careful diplomatic mask he'd worn for 15 years was completely gone. The measured political responses, the calculated considerations for galactic peace, 3,000 years of civilized cooperation, all of it had been burned away like morning mist, leaving behind something primitive and absolutely terrifying. "Hegemony vessels," Jake began, his voice carrying across the void with crystal-clear digital precision. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Terran Space Force vessel Resolute. I'm looking at what you've done to Colony 7 right now. I can see 300,000 human civilians who apparently died for the terrible crime of existing in the same galaxy as you." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle across space like falling snow. When he continued speaking, there was something in his tone that made his own crew unconsciously take several steps backward. "I want you to understand something about humans that seems to have gotten lost in translation somewhere during the past 3,000 years. We are not a peaceful species. We never have been. For 30 centuries, we've been playing nice because someone convinced us it was the civilized thing to do. That cooperation was better than conflict. That being truly civilized meant suppressing our more primitive instincts." The tactical display showed the hegemony fleet beginning to shift positions, moving into standard attack formations like pieces on a chessboard. Jake didn't even glance at the screen. "But you made one critical mistake down there on that planet. You didn't just kill our people quickly and move on to your next target. You made sure we could hear them dying. You wanted us to know that you could murder our children while we sat helpless in our ships, bound by ancient treaty words written on paper." Jake's smile would have made a great white shark think twice about attacking. "You seem to have forgotten that we're the species that crawled out of Earth's primordial swamps by being better killers than everything else that lived there. You forgot that we're the species that turned warfare into high art before we even learned how to write our own names. You forgot that we spent 10,000 years perfecting the fine art of making our enemies suffer before we ever built our first rocket ship." The first wave of hegemony missiles appeared on the tactical display like angry red streaks, racing toward the Resolute at incredible speed. "Marcus, Jake said in the same conversational tone he might use to order coffee. Please show these gentlemen what 3,000 years of suppressed human innovation looks like when we finally take the gloves off. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson's hands moved across his tactical console like a master pianist performing his greatest symphony. Each button press was deliberate, precise, deadly. The TSF Resolute had always looked like just another deep space exploration ship, the kind that carried scientists and diplomats to boring conferences on distant worlds. But like every human vessel built after the ceasefire accords, it had been designed with secrets that the hegemony had never even suspected existed. Defensive systems coming online now, Thompson reported, his voice rock-steady despite the fact that dozens of hegemony missiles were screaming toward them through the vacuum of space. Engaging Protocol 7. The moment those words left his mouth, the space around the Resolute transformed into something that looked like the birth of a new star. Energy patterns that hadn't been seen for 3,000 years suddenly blazed to life around the ship's hull. Point defense systems operating on physics principles that hegemony scientists didn't even have names for reached out and touched each incoming missile with fingers of pure energy. One by one, the deadly projectiles turned into brilliant fireworks that lit up the darkness like a twisted celebration. But Thompson was just getting started. Emma, Captain Morrison said calmly, as if he wasn't watching 4 to 7 enemy warships trying to kill him, please transmit the Mozart file to all hegemony vessels in the system. Communications Officer Rodriguez paused at her console, her fingers hovering over the keys. The Mozart file, sir? Are you sure about this? Trust me on this one. Emma's hands flew over her controls, sending out what appeared to be a standard diplomatic data package to every single hegemony ship. Their computers accepted the transmission automatically, just as they'd been programmed to do for thousands of years. It was supposed to be a simple cultural exchange file, maybe some human music or poetry to help promote galactic understanding. The hegemony crews had no idea they'd just invited a digital demon into their ship's computer systems. Captain, Commander Williams called out, staring at her tactical display with complete amazement, something very strange is happening to their fleet. The hegemony ships were starting to turn on each other, but not in the way anyone expected. This wasn't physical combat, it was something far more insidious and terrifying. The Mozart file was a masterpiece of human psychological warfare, a program that had taken 3,000 years to perfect. It analyzed alien crew communications in real time, learned their deepest fears and phobias, then began broadcasting those terrors directly into their minds through their own ship's communication systems. Within minutes, the mighty hegemony fleet was tearing itself apart from the inside. Crew members were experiencing nightmares that felt more real than reality. Ancient evolutionary fears that their species had forgotten were suddenly flooding back in full force. Some aliens were seeing predators that had hunted their ancestors millions of years ago. Others were reliving the worst moments of their entire lives over and over again. The fleet's perfect formation dissolved into chaos as ships began firing randomly, their crews no longer able to tell friend from foe through the haze of artificially induced terror. 3,000 years ago, Jake explained to his stunned bridge crew, we were limited by primitive computers and our basic understanding of alien psychology. We've had plenty of time to improve both of those things. But 6 hegemony dreadnoughts kept coming toward them, their massive hulls cutting through space like metallic sharks. These ships were controlled entirely by artificial intelligence systems, immune to psychological warfare. Their combined firepower was enough to crack planets in half and turn moons into asteroid fields. Danny, Jake called to his chief engineer, I think it's time for that family reunion we talked about. Chief Engineer Danny Park looked up from his console, his eyes still red from crying over his sister's death, but his expression set with the kind of grim satisfaction that comes right before revenge. Yes sir, Captain. Initiating the Lisa protocol right now. The TSF Resolute began to change. Hull panels that had looked like simple armor plating for 15 years suddenly unfolded like massive metallic flowers. Weapon systems that defied every known law of physics emerged from hidden compartments throughout the ship's structure. What had appeared to be a peaceful exploration vessel was revealing its true nature, something that would have given nightmares to the galaxy's most experienced military strategists. Sir, Thompson called out, his voice carrying a note of pure awe, I'm reading massive energy signatures throughout the entire system. It's like half the asteroids floating around out here aren't actually asteroids at all. Jake nodded grimly, watching his tactical display light up like a Christmas tree. The hegemony wasn't the only species preparing for the possibility that the ceasefire accords might someday end. Every single human colony established after the peace treaty included certain special contingencies. The tactical display exploded with new contacts as dozens of previously invisible human vessels suddenly decloaked throughout the system. These weren't just ships. Entire artificial asteroid fields that had been hiding in plain sight for decades suddenly revealed themselves to be hollow shells concealing military installations that belonged in science fiction novels. Mining stations became weapons platforms. Cargo haulers unfolded into battleships. Research facilities revealed missile batteries that had been disguised as sensor arrays. The hegemony fleet, which moments before had outnumbered the humans 4-7-1, suddenly found itself surrounded by enemies that had been patiently waiting for this exact moment. 4-7 ships, Jake mused, watching the enemy dreadnoughts finally realize they'd flown straight into a trap that had been 3,000 years in the making. You know what we call that in human military doctrine? His crew waited, hanging on every word. A target-rich environment. What happened next couldn't really be called a battle. It was more like a demonstration of what happens when you spend 3 millennia perfecting the art of war while pretending to be peaceful. The hegemony vessels didn't just lose the fight, they were taken apart with surgical precision by weapons that operated on principles their science couldn't explain. Human ships moved through space like deadly dancers, weaving between enemy fire that couldn't touch them. Energy beams that could cut through dreadnought armor like butter reached out from hidden installations. The hegemony crews had just enough time to broadcast their terror back to their homeworlds before their ships became expanding clouds of superheated gas and twisted metal. 17 minutes. That's how long it took to destroy an entire hegemony fleet. When the last enemy vessel disappeared in a brief flash of light, Jake's crew stood in complete silence on a bridge illuminated only by the soft glow of victory displays and the distant, dying fires of New Haven's murdered cities. "Captain," Emma whispered, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command. Admiral Hayes is demanding our immediate surrender to face court-martial proceedings." Jake looked at the communication panel, then at his crew, then out at the empty space where moments before 4-7 enemy warships had been learning what 3,000 years of human creativity looked like when applied with lethal intent. "Emma," he said quietly, "open a communications channel to every human vessel, colony, and installation in known space. Maximum broadcast power." "Sir? What are you planning to do?" Jake's smile could have melted steel. "It's time to let our people know that the 3,000-year timeout period is officially over. And it's time to remind the galaxy why humans used to be feared." The transmission began on Earth, racing through hyperspace communication relays at the speed of light. Within minutes, it reached every human colony, every space station, every mining outpost scattered across 100 star systems. 10 billion people stopped what they were doing, stopped eating dinner, stopped working, stopped playing with their children, to listen to words that would change everything. "My name is Captain Jake Morrison," the voice said, calm and steady despite the incredible scene visible behind him. Through the static of interstellar communication, everyone could see the glowing debris field that had once been 47 hegemony warships. Twisted metal drifted through space like the remains of some massive funeral pyre. 3 hours ago, Colony 7 was completely destroyed by alien forces while human military fleets sat by and watched, bound by a treaty that was signed before any of us were even born. On Earth, deep beneath the Swiss mountains in Fleet Command headquarters, Admiral Rebecca Hayes stood surrounded by her staff officers. They stared at the tactical displays with faces that showed a mixture of absolute horror and grudging admiration. The real-time combat data streaming in from the TSF Resolute showed battle patterns that shouldn't have been possible with any known human technology. Ships moving in ways that defied physics. Weapons that operated on principles their best scientists couldn't begin to explain. "For 3,000 years, Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the galaxy with digital clarity, we have faithfully honored the ceasefire accords. We've stayed quietly within our designated borders, carefully limited our technology development, and pretended that galactic cooperation was more important than our own survival. Today, that pretense ends forever." President Michael Torres sat in his office in New Geneva, watching the broadcast on screens that filled an entire wall. Around him, his advisors ran back and forth like frightened mice, frantically trying to calculate the political implications of what was happening. Behind them, intelligence reports flooded in from across human space. Similar incidents were occurring everywhere as military units that had been quietly preparing for this exact day suddenly activated secret protocols that even most government officials hadn't known existed. "The hegemony leadership believes we're a naturally peaceful species." Morrison's voice carried a note of dark amusement that sent chills down the spines of everyone listening. "They're completely wrong about that. We're not peaceful by nature, we're patient. For 3,000 years, we've been carefully studying everything about our galactic neighbors. Their technology, their psychology, their deepest fears, their critical weaknesses. We've been preparing for the day when patience would no longer be sufficient. In the deep asteroid mining facilities scattered throughout the belt, workers who had spent decades installing what everyone believed was standard mining equipment began the careful process of revealing what they'd actually been building all this time. Massive weapons platforms that had been disguised as simple industrial machinery. Manufacturing facilities that had been producing agricultural supplies but could switch to military hardware production within hours. Transport vessels that looked completely civilian from the outside but carried enough concealed firepower to level entire continents. The transformation was happening everywhere at once. Cargo ships suddenly sprouted missile batteries from hidden compartments. Research stations revealed sensor arrays that were actually targeting systems. Even some asteroids themselves began splitting open to reveal hollow interiors packed with weapons that had been waiting decades for this moment. To every human being listening to this broadcast right now, Morrison continued, his voice growing harder and more determined with each word, the hegemony has officially declared war on our entire species. They've systematically murdered our children, completely destroyed our peaceful colonies, and made it crystal clear that they consider human lives to be completely expendable. I'm here to inform them, and anyone else who might be listening, that this was a serious miscalculation on their part. The tactical display in Fleet Command showed something that made even battle-hardened Admiral Hayes take an involuntary step backward. Human vessels were decloaking throughout the galaxy, not just dozens or hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of ships. Vessels that had been disguised as harmless freighters, innocent research ships, even floating space debris were suddenly revealing their true military nature. The hegemony's intelligence estimates of human military capability had been wrong by several orders of magnitude. We are definitely not the same species that desperately begged for peace 3,000 years ago. Morrison's voice was growing harder now, carrying an edge that made veteran military officers unconsciously check their weapons. We're their direct descendants, and we've had 3 full millennia to get extremely creative about the art of warfare. Meanwhile, on Hegemony Prime, Supreme Chancellor Vexthara stood frozen in her crystalline war room, watching intelligence reports that completely contradicted everything her species had believed about human capabilities for thousands of years. The total destruction of the Third Pacification Fleet had been accomplished with technology that their most advanced scientists couldn't even begin to understand. Even worse, their long-range sensors were now detecting human military vessels throughout hegemony space, ships that definitely hadn't been there just an hour ago but were now broadcasting their presence like an open challenge to fight. To the hegemony leadership specifically, Morrison's voice cut through the static of interstellar communication with laser-like clarity. You wanted to see exactly what happens when humans are pushed beyond their breaking point. Congratulations on your success. You're about to discover firsthand what 3,000 years of deliberately suppressed human warfare innovation looks like when we finally stop playing by your restrictive rules. The broadcast paused for a moment, and across human space, entire families gathered around communication screens to see a tired-looking man in a fleet uniform standing calmly on the bridge of a warship, surrounded by the glowing aftermath of the most completely one-sided military engagement in recorded galactic history. Effective immediately, Morrison continued with absolute finality, the ceasefire accords are permanently null and void. Any alien vessel that approaches human space without our explicit written permission will be automatically considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. Any alien military force that threatens human civilians will be met with completely overwhelming response. Any alien government that provides support for aggression against humanity will quickly discover why our primitive ancestors were considered the most dangerous predators on a planet that was absolutely full of dangerous predators. He paused again, and his smile was clearly visible even through the interference of interstellar transmission. To our extended human family spread across the stars, welcome to the Second Human War. This time, we're not fighting desperately for mere survival. We're fighting for the fundamental right to exist in this galaxy without asking anyone's permission first. The transmission ended, leaving 10 billion humans and countless alien observers to contemplate a galaxy that had just been permanently transformed. Within 6 hours, 17 different hegemony worlds had surrendered without a single shot being fired. Within 12 hours, 4 separate alien species had urgently requested immediate diplomatic contact with the Terran Confederation. Within 24 hours, Supreme Chancellor Vexthara herself was desperately broadcasting offers of unconditional ceasefire. But by then, humanity had remembered something they'd completely forgotten during 3 millennia of enforced peace. Sometimes, the most effective way to ensure lasting peace is to make absolutely certain that everyone clearly understands the terrible cost of disrupting it. The galaxy was about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible.